Hey everyone! When you're building an application with Amplify, chances are that you want to work on your own local machine, maybe in an IDE like Visual Studio Code. But there is some setup required to get that working, and that's what this video is all about. This is going to be based roughly on the documentation here. I've included a link to this below, so feel free to reference that. I will call out that I'm in Gen 2, and the framework over here doesn't matter so much. We're not going to be writing application code. This is all just about getting the environment set up, but I am in React. As far as what else you need to follow along, you will obviously need an AWS account, and you should be logged in as a user with admin permissions. You should be at least somewhat familiar with IAM Identity Center. If you're not, I'll cover the basics and I'll point you to another video that might help. And I'll also be setting up Identity Center from scratch, so feel free to just follow along step by step there if you need to. And then you'll also need the AWS CLI installed. There is a link to this in the guide, so I will point it out when we get there. As far as what this will cost, absolutely nothing. So the services that we're going to be working with, Identity Center, AWS CLI, those are all just totally free. But if you do want to clean up the stuff that we set up together, make sure you stick around to the end, and I'll show you how to delete everything. Okay, back to the documentation. So let's spend just a second talking about why we're using Identity Center and Organizations, which incidentally you don't have to do, but it does seem like Amazon's kind of pushing us that direction generally, so that's what I'm going with, and that's what this guide will walk through. There are other options though here at this link, so feel free to check that out if you don't want to go with Identity Center and Organizations, but that's pretty much what this video is going to do. If we back up just a little bit, if you've worked with AWS for any amount of time, you're probably familiar with Identity and Access Management, or IAM, and regular IAM is what I'm calling this. It's not Identity Center. If you're just an individual working with IAM, you create a user for yourself, maybe an admin user, and you work with your one account, life is pretty easy. But if you're on a team or you have multiple accounts that you need to access, say like a dev, a test, and a prod account, things can get a little bit clunky. You either have to log into each account separately, you've got different keys to manage and so on, log out of the account, or you can log into one account, assume a role to another account, and that kind of thing. And if you have an entire team doing that, it's just not ideal, and it gets a little bit tedious. This all gets a lot easier with IAM Identity Center, and incidentally, this used to be called SSO, Single Sign-On, so you will still see that referenced in places. But with Identity Center, you can set up an AWS Organization, which is a way to manage multiple accounts. Identity Center will provision the permissions and roles and such to grant access to whatever accounts you should have access to, and then you just need to log in to Identity Center with Single Sign-On or SSO, and then you'll get access to those accounts without having to do separate logins. There's a portal that you can browse to and log into your accounts there, but as you're working locally on your machine, like in Visual Studio or something, the way you're going to log in and access resources is through the AWS CLI. So that's the big picture of where we're going with all of this and what's happening in the back end. But I wanted to simplify this diagram a little bit. We're only going to have the one account, but let's walk through what we're going to be doing in the rest of the video. Let's go set up Identity Center to work with an organization. And an organization doesn't have to have multiple accounts. It totally works with just one account, which is what I'm going to do. But we'll get all this set up with a user and permissions and so on. Out here in the AWS console, I've navigated to Identity Center. I'm in the US West 2 region in Oregon. You can only set this up in one region, so just pay attention to what region you're in. And then we will say Enable. There are two options here. You can enable with an organization or only with this account. Like I mentioned, we're going to go with the organization, even though I do just have the one account. And if you haven't set up an organization yet, when we click Continue here, that will happen for us behind the scenes. So let's continue. Now just a heads up, sometimes on that last screen, you'll get a rate exceeded message, and it looks like things failed. But in most cases, they work just fine, and you can always go validate that. So let's go, I'll open up a new tab here, and let's go into Organizations and just see that it created the organization for us. Organizations is just like any other service. I'm just going to go to my recently visited here. Okay, and here's my organization. So it automatically created a root at the top of the structure, and then the one account that I have. Like magic. One other thing that might happen just to give you all the potential gotchas here, is when you're back here in Identity Center and you just try to enable Identity Center with Organizations, you could also get a message saying that Organizations doesn't have trust with Identity Center. It'll give you a message that's pretty self-explanatory, but let me just show you what it does. If you come under Services, and if we scroll down to Identity Center here, you'll see that was enabled. And that happened automatically, which is perfect, but there have been a couple of times where it didn't work. So those are two potential issues that you could come across. If it didn't work, you'll just come in here, click on this, and enable it for that trust relationship, and you should be good to go. But in this case, everything worked perfectly, so yay. Let me come back to Identity Center. It looks like everything worked here. We don't currently have any users. We don't have any permission sets or anything, so it's basically just an empty instance at the moment. We need to add users and permissions. Now, if you come back to the guide here, if you're following along with this, it goes through those first couple of steps, and then there is some code here to automate things. And you'll see down here, it has you open up a Cloud Shell window and issue all of these different commands that'll set up the user, permission sets, and so on. Feel free to do that. I personally like to do things manually, just so I understand a little bit better what's going on. So that's what we're going to do. We'll come back to Identity Center, and we need to create a permission set. This defines the level of access that users and groups will have to an AWS account. They're basically templates of IAM roles. So let's create permission set. There are some predefined permission sets, but we're actually going to go with a custom permission set and say next. You want to expand AWS Managed Policies, and then just filter here for Amplify. And the one you want is this second one here, Amplify Backend Deploy Full Access. Select that. That will ensure that our user has the ability to do everything they need to do, and click Next. The name for this permission set, we'll call it Amplify-Policy, and I would recommend going with this name because that's what's referenced in the guide, and it'll come up later as well. For a session duration, this is the amount of time a user can be logged in before the console is going to automatically log them out. I'm just going to stick with 1 hour, but this is configurable if you want something longer. Then say Next. And scrolling down, review everything, and create. Okay, so that's the permission set, basically what somebody would be able to do. And now we need to create a user who could use that permission set. So we'll come over here to Users on the left-hand navigation, and we'll add a user. For username, I'll go with Amplify-admin. I would recommend sticking with this name again, just because it's referenced in the guide. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and generate a one-time password that I can share. You can also send an email with those instructions, and it does have to be a valid email because it's going to send you some. For first name and last name here, I'm going to go with Amplify admin, and then scrolling down, we'll go next. We can skip the groups and just say next. Review all the details, and then add user. Okay, so now it's showing us the URL to log into the portal. We've got the username and then a one-time password. I'm just going to copy this to my clipboard, and then I'll go drop it in Notepad. There we go. We will need some of this later, so just make sure you jot it down somewhere. Okay, I'll close out of this. Now we have a user, but at the moment they don't have access to the AWS account. So let's do that next. We'll come over here on the left to AWS Accounts. And we want to give them access to this account, the only one that I have in this particular organization. So I'll select that one and then say Assign Users or Groups. You want the Users tab up here. Select the name of your user, Amplify Admin, and say Next. And then the permission set, so what level of access does this user have on the account? And it's going to be that Amplify policy that we set up. Next. Review everything, and submit. Okay, looking good. There are a couple of other things we need to do, though, just to finish validating our user. So I'll come back to Users over here and click into the one user that we have, Amplify Admin. Before our user can do anything, they need to verify their email address. So let's send that email verification now. Send. Let me go check my email. So there's a link in that email to verify the email address. I've clicked on that and have been verified. Now let's go ahead and log in, and we need to change our password as well. Username was amplify-admin. And then I set a one-time password that I put in Notepad, so let me grab that. It was this right here. And then you do also need to set up multi-factor authentication. I'm just going to go with the Authenticator app here. I've got Google Authenticator on my phone. So on my phone, I'm trying to add a new account and asked it to scan a QR code. So I'll make that code visible here. On my phone, I just scanned the code, and now there's a code visible that I'll enter here. And then we should be good to go. Final step is to change our password. So I'll put in a new password here and set that password. Okay, so this is what we've done so far. We set up Identity Center with an organization, just the one account. We added the Amplify admin user, assigned them the admin permission set, and then gave them access to that single AWS account that we have in the organization. Cool. Now let's work on this piece, being able to interact with the resources in that account from my local dev environment using the AWS CLI. If you don't already have the CLI installed, just scroll down to this section here, Finish Local Setup number 3. There's a link to grab the install, whether you're on Mac, Windows, or Linux. So just install that, and it should be pretty straightforward. I've already got it installed on mine. And after you've installed it, you should be able to issue commands from a terminal inside of VS Code, or from a PowerShell window, or your terminal window on Mac, and so on. Next thing we need to do is set up an AWS profile. And I personally don't think I understood profiles until I saw what happens on your local file system. So let me just show you that to preface what we're about to do. I'm running on Windows, so under my user profile folder, there's a folder called .aws. Here is the equivalent for those of you on Mac or Linux. And there's this file called config. This file contains the information that we need to connect to our AWS resources. So we've got our account ID, we've got our role name, our region, and so on. You can have multiple profiles as well. So maybe you've got one for your default, you have one for testing, one for dev, or something like that. And since we're going to be using SSO, you'll see we've got that SSO part in here as well with our start URL. That's where we're going to be prompted to log in and so forth. So setting up an AWS profile is basically creating this config file. On my Windows machine, I can do that from my PowerShell window, or if I were in VS Code, I could bring up a terminal. You can use a terminal in Mac and so on. But the command we want is AWS configure SSO. I'm just going to bring this up side by side next to the documentation, and we'll fill in the details. Now, if you already have a config file, if you've already set up your profile, then you won't need to do this again. In fact, it'll start filling in information for you. So in my case, I just want to rename that file so it's not pulling from that file. Just a heads up there. But I'm going to go with all of the information here that it recommends from the guide. So SSO session name, amplify-admin. The start URL, you can get this out of Identity Center. I had also copied it to Notepad earlier, so let me grab that. That's this one right here, the AWS Access Portal URL. Region, I am in US West 2, but if you're in a different region, then enter that. For registration scopes, the recommendation here is to leave this blank, so I'm just going to hit enter. And then on this next step, a browser should automatically launch with this code. So you want to compare this code to what you're getting back in your terminal window. And it looks the same, so I will confirm and continue. Then it's going to prompt us to log in. And our password, sign in, MFA code. And because the AWS CLI is built on top of the SDK for Python, which is called Bodo, you might get some messages with this Bodo core variation in the name, and that's okay. We want to allow access here. And request approved. Excellent. So we can close out of this window now. back to my PowerShell window and back to the guide, you'll see here, after you provide the information, the browser will open. We've already done that. And then here is what we've got, the account available. All this information over here is matching up to what we've got here. But we need to enter a couple of other things. So the default client region, here again, I'm using US West 2. Yours might be different though. And then the output format, I'm just going to leave that blank and hit enter. And then scrolling down here, it's saying make sure to set the profile name to default. Or if you use something else, just remember what that name is. Okay, now let's go look at the config file. So I have a new file here, config. This is the one that I renamed earlier, so this is the brand new one that just got created. So we've got the default profile, we've got the SSO session information, and everything looks good. Incidentally, there is one other folder here that might be of interest to you, and that's the SSO folder. There should be a file in here, or a folder, called cache, and a bunch of JSON files. Let me just open this latest one here. So these JSON files contain a JWT, a JSON Web Token, that's used to get your temporary security credentials. And these are just temporary credentials, so they're going to expire. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see when they're going to expire. So registration expires at, and then the time. After it expires, you're going to get error messages when you try to make calls to AWS from your local environment. The error message is usually pretty self-explanatory, but there is a blurb in there about using AWS SSO login. And that's all you'll need to do is say AWS SSO login. It will bring up a browser for you to log in again, and that will refresh your session so you can continue using some new temporary credentials. So just a heads up there. But let's go see if all of this worked. Over here in PowerShell, it's giving us a sample command that we could use to list our S3 buckets, but we don't actually have permissions on S3 under this Amplify policy. You remember we just had access to the Amplify policy. So let's try an Amplify command instead. We'll do AWS Amplify list-apps. And if you have any Amplify apps already, then this should list them. I have a handful out there, and it's pulling back information about the app. It's my quiz app too. I've got others that will continue on here. But it looks like everything's working. If you don't have apps, that's okay. As long as it's not coming back with some kind of permissions issue or something like that, then everything should be good on your side as well. Now back to the documentation over here. The next step is about bootstrapping your AWS account, setting up a sandbox and all of that. But this is going to require you to go in and set up an Amplify project and some other steps. So I'm not going to go through these in this video, but I do want to point you to this other video where we go and create an Amplify application, set up the sandbox, actually deploy something. It's a fun to-do app where you can create to-dos and delete them, and you get login functionality and all of that. So check that out if you want to actually build out the app. But for what we're doing here, we've got Identity Center and the organization set up. We've got the user, we've got our permissions, we've got access to the account, and finally, we've got the AWS profile that will let us issue commands from the AWS CLI. So, awesome work. Now, before I let you go, let's go clean up our resources. There are no costs for things like Identity Center or Organizations or the CLI, but if you just want to keep things nice and tidy, then let me show you how to delete them. Coming back to Identity Center, let's go delete everything here. You'll want to come into Settings on the left-hand nav here, and then scrolling down to the Management tab, this option down here to delete your Identity Center instance, say delete. And this is a really big deal to delete this. So the one I created was just for this demo. If you have something in the real world that you're already using, please do not delete it unless you really know what you're doing. You'll have to confirm that all of these things will be deleted and confirm. And then we're also going to delete our organization. So back to organizations. One thing to note here is you can only delete an organization if there's only a single account left, your management account. In my case, that's the one and only account, so we're good there. But if you had multiple accounts under here, you would have to delete those or remove them from the organization. And you'll have that option up here to remove from organization if you have other non-management accounts. So that's how that works. But let's come into Settings, and then scrolling down, delete Organization. Once again, make sure you know what you're doing here, and delete Organization. Okay, so that is how to configure AWS Amplify Gen 2 for local development. If you found that helpful, give me a thumbs up on the video so YouTube knows to share it with more people, and also consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you so much for watching.